In February of 2013, a construction crew working on the renovation of the Gaillard Center in downtown Charleston, South Carolina, cut a trench along the corner of George and Anson streets and stopped. What the machine had opened was not the utility line the crew was expecting. It was a shallow grave, and then another beside it, and within days the excavation had exposed a burial ground that appeared on no historical map, no city plat, and no parish register anywhere in the archival record of Charleston. Archaeologists from Brockington and Associates, led by Dr. Eric Poplin, were called to the site before construction could resume, and what they eventually documented was a cemetery containing the remains of 36 people, laid in the ground with evident care sometime between 1760 and 1790, on a stretch of land that had passed through the hands of multiple owners across the 18th and 19th centuries without a single surviving deed, plat, or church record ever describing a burial ground there at all. The land had been subdivided for residential development around 1800. Whoever put these 36 people in the earth did so at least a decade before that, and left no paper behind to say they had done it. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. The absence of documentation is, on its own, not unusual for 18th century Charleston. What makes the Anson Street site different is how completely the silence holds. Poplin's report notes that archival and archaeological evidence, including 19th century refuse pits cut into the soil above the graves, confirms the burials predate the residential development that eventually covered the land, which means the cemetery was already forgotten by the time Charleston built houses on top of it. No church claimed it, no family plot record names it. The people buried there were, by every indication available to archaeologists, of African descent, interred in a city that was at the time one of the busiest ports of entry for the transatlantic slave trade in North America, a city where a formal, recorded burial was a privilege extended reliably to white congregants of established churches and only inconsistently, if at all, to the enslaved and free black Charlestonians, who made up close to half the population by the mid-18th century, and who often outnumbered the city's white residents outright in the decades on either side of the American Revolution. Baptism registers, marriage records, and burial notices for that population survive only in fragments, scattered across church ledgers that treated enslaved people as property, to be listed alongside livestock and furniture rather than as parishioners with names worth cross-referencing against a grave. The absence of a record at Anson Street is not evidence that something was hidden after the fact, in the sense of a document destroyed or a map redrawn to leave a blank space. It is evidence that almost nothing about these 36 lives was ever considered worth recording in the first place, which is a different and in some ways heavier kind of erasure, one built into the ordinary paperwork of the city rather than smuggled around it. The archaeologist noted that the bodies had been placed in 4 closely aligned rows, all of them oriented east to west, the burials evenly spaced and evidently planned rather than hurried. Among the grave goods recovered was a pair of British copper halfpennies, one of them found resting in the eye socket of a child. The coin was dated 1773, which meant it had been minted and had already crossed an ocean before it was placed in the ground, with a child too young to have chosen either the coin's meaning or its journey. Nothing in any surviving Charleston record explains the placement of that coin, and nothing needs to. The custom of laying coins over the eyes of the dead runs through multiple cultures on both sides of the Atlantic, and whoever buried that child knew the gesture and made it anyway, on unconsecrated, unrecorded ground, for a person the city's own institutions would not think worth naming for another 246 years. What the ground gave up, decades later, filled in some of what the paper never held. Isotopic analysis conducted as part of the broader research project found that at least 6 of the 36 individuals were born in West or West Central Africa, meaning they survived the Middle Passage and spent their final years in a city that had shipped them there. Ancient DNA work led by Dr. Theodore Scher of the University of Pennsylvania, with researcher Raquel Flesquez, began to reconstruct fragments of ancestry and biological relationship among the group that no surviving document could have supplied. Some of the dead had been buried in shrouds. Some had been buried in clothing, with personal items placed beside them, the kind of small deliberate gestures that indicate people who were mourned by others who cared enough to prepare them properly for the ground, whatever the city's own records chose not to notice. In 2017, Charleston's mayor, John Tecklenburg, asked the Gullah Society, led by anthropologist Ade Ofuniyin, to guide the process of memorializing and eventually reinterring the remains. It took 2 more years of community meetings, research, and coordination between the city, the College of Charleston, and the University of Pennsylvania before the 36 were given names. On April 27, 2019, at McLeod Plantation Historic Site, Yoruba priests Natalie Washington Wyke and Terence Wyke joined Ofuniyin in a traditional naming ceremony, conferring African and Gullah Geechee names on each of the 36, Babatunde, Lima, Mbangi, Zimbu, Tima, Isi, Peter, Wuta, Fumu, Banza, Amina, Ola, Yawo, Nana, Daba, and the child with the coin over her eye socket, who was named Welela. Washington Wyke described the naming as a way of restoring humanity to people who had likely been forced across the Atlantic by others who regarded them as property rather than as people. On May 3rd, Schur and Flesquez presented a summary of the ancient DNA findings at the Gaillard Center itself, in the same building whose renovation had disturbed their rest 6 years earlier. On May 4th, the remains were returned to the ground at Anson Street in a reinterment ceremony, with drumming and dance filling a corner of the city that for 2 centuries had simply been a sidewalk. Ofuniyin did not live to see the permanent memorial completed. The sculptor Stephen L. Hayes Jr. was commissioned to design it, a fountain ringed with bronze casts of hands modelled on black Charleston residents close in age to the 36 who had been found, and the finished memorial was dedicated on December 14, 2025, more than 12 years after the backhoe first opened the ground. The Anson Street ground is not an isolated anomaly in Charleston's relationship to its own subsurface. It is the loudest and most recent example of a pattern that runs under nearly the entire historic peninsula, a pattern in which the city's written record and the city's actual ground have never fully agreed with each other, and the ground periodically wins the argument. Half a mile north of Anson Street, the graveyard behind the circular Congregational Church on Meeting Street offers something like the photographic negative of that story. Founded in 1681, the congregation's burial ground holds an unmarked grave believed to be that of Henry Simons, dated to 1695, which church records identify as the oldest known burial site still in existence in the city. More than 500 stones survive there today, naming around 730 individuals, and church records account for roughly 600 more who were likely buried on the grounds without a marker to show it. One of the oldest features in the yard is a small domed brick vault built over the Simons family plot, a structure local historians describe as a practical response to Charleston's geography rather than a decorative flourish. The water table on the peninsula sits close enough to the surface that an ordinary grave, in heavy rain, risks having its casket lifted and shifted by rising groundwater. The dome was built to keep the dead from floating. The circular graveyard has taken its own share of damage across 3 centuries, most memorably in 1780, when a British cannonball exploded among the headstones during Sunday services in the middle of the siege that would eventually deliver the city and its old exchange basement into enemy hands. What survived that and everything since is an unusually complete record for 18th century Charleston. Gravestones attributed to New England carvers shipped south for wealthy Huguenot and English families, portrait stones of a style and quantity that local historians believe may exceed any other single graveyard in the country, and named burial vaults, including one belonging to the Hudson Perrineau family that holds an estimated 18 or more members across multiple generations. Every name in that vault is known. Every date is carved in stone and cross-referenced against church membership rolls that have survived hurricanes, fires, a war, and an earthquake. It is, in other words, everything the ground at Anson Street is not, and the difference between the two graveyards has nothing to do with the durability of stone or the mercy of soil. It has to do with who the city decided, in the 18th century, was worth carving a name into rock for. That single detail, the domed vault built to keep a family's caskets from lifting in the rain, says something about the entire city that the circular graveyard's careful, catalogued permanence obscures at first glance. Charleston was founded on a low, marshy peninsula between two rivers, built up over 3 centuries with fill dirt, ballast stone, oyster shell tabby, and whatever else was available to raise the ground high enough to build on. The water underneath never fully went away. It moved into cisterns, into wells, into the brick-lined chambers built beneath nearly every house constructed before the city's public water system arrived, and it is still there today, shaping what survives underground and what does not, deciding on its own schedule what gets pushed back up to the surface. The people the circular church's own record-keeping routinely excluded understood the water beneath the city in a different register entirely, one that never depended on a church ledger to survive. Enslaved and free black Charlestonians, many of them descended from the Gullah Geechee communities of the Low Country's rice plantations and barrier islands, carried a body of spiritual practice from West and Central Africa that treated the boundary between water and land as the boundary between the living and the restless dead. A haint in that tradition is a spirit that cannot cross running water, and the belief produced a piece of architecture that survives on Charleston porches today in a shade of pale blue-green known simply as haint blue, painted onto porch ceilings, window frames, and doors to convince a wandering spirit that the sky, or the water, had already closed in front of it. The tradition sits alongside hoodoo, or root work, a system of herbal and spiritual practice maintained by conjurers and root doctors across the Low Country, largely undocumented by the same institutions that carefully catalogued the Perrineau family's headstones a few blocks away. No church register recorded who painted the first Charleston porch ceiling blue, or when, or why, in the same way no plat map recorded the ground at Anson Street. The knowledge moved through practice and repetition instead, porch to porch, generation to generation, in a city where water has always meant something more than plumbing. The old Exchange and Provost Dungeon, standing at the foot of Broad Street since it was commissioned by the Colonial Assembly in 1767 and completed in 1771, sits directly on top of one of the clearest examples of that layering. The building was designed by William Rigby Naylor and built by Peter and John Hallbeck on the site of the old watch house, itself built into the remains of the Half Moon Battery, part of the defensive seawall that had ringed Charlestown since the late 17th century. For 2 centuries after the Exchange went up, the Half Moon Battery existed mostly as a rumour beneath the building's foundation, referenced in old surveys but not confirmed by anyone standing in the basement with a trowel. It was not until 1965 that the remaining portions of the battery were physically located and preserved beneath the structure, meaning the customs house that hosted South Carolina's ratification debate over the United States Constitution in 1788, and that held captured Patriot leaders as prisoners of the British provost after the siege of 1780, had been standing for nearly 200 years directly on top of a colonial-era fortification that nobody had gone down to confirm. The building's own basement carries a comparable layer of buried action. During the British siege of Charleston in 1780, General William Moultrie ordered thousands of pounds of gunpowder moved out of the city's powder magazine and into the Exchange's basement, where it was bricked up out of sight to keep it from falling into enemy hands. When the city fell shortly afterward, the British converted that same basement into the Provost Dungeon, a prison that held American prisoners of war, captured Patriot officials, and enslaved people caught up in the war's chaos, some of them confined within a stone's throw of a wall of hidden gunpowder that the record suggests nobody bothered, or dared, to remove for some time. Above that basement, on the building's main floor, and on the open lot along its north side, The exchange served for decades as one of Charleston's most active sites for the public sale of enslaved men, women, and children, a use documented in the building's own surviving business and newspaper records with the same institutional thoroughness that never extended to the people being sold. In 1773, the same main floor had briefly served the opposite purpose, hosting protests against British taxation, while hundreds of chests of taxed tea sat stored below in the same basement that would later hold gunpowder and prisoners. The building went on to serve as a post office through the 19th century, until damage from a single night in 1886 forced the federal government to vacate it a decade later. The Daughters of the American Revolution took over its preservation in 1913 and have maintained it since, which is the reason a visitor today can still walk down into the same basement that held tea, then gunpowder, then prisoners, then a colonial seawall nobody had gone looking for. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. That single night was August 31st, 1886, at roughly 10 minutes to 10 in the evening, when an earthquake now estimated at somewhere between magnitude 7.0 and 7.3 struck the South Carolina coast and rearranged the ground under Charleston in about a minute of shaking. It remains the most powerful earthquake ever recorded on the east coast of the United States. At least 60 people were killed, and around 2,000 structures across the region sustained damage estimated at $5 to $6 million, an enormous sum for 1886. 40 kilometers outside the city, a fissure, more than 600 meters long, tore open the ground. A railroad trestle lurched 2 meters out of alignment, dams broke and flooded roads and farmland. But the damage that mattered most for what lay beneath the peninsula was liquefaction, the process by which violently shaken, water-saturated sand loses its solid structure and briefly behaves like a fluid. Across the Charleston area, that liquefied sand forced its way up through cracks in the surface in what geologists call sand blows, leaving behind craterlets as wide as 6 meters, some of them ejecting blue-gray mud and multicolored sand that residents later collected and sold as souvenirs. The same forces that opened the ground into countless small mouths across the low-country cracked walls, twisted iron, and toppled thousands of chimneys across a city built, like the graveyard on Meeting Street already understood, on ground that had never been as solid as it looked from the street. The old exchange did not escape the shaking, and neither did most of the historic peninsula's brick building stock. In the years afterward, Charleston's builders and engineers retrofitted damaged masonry structures with a device that has since become one of the city's most recognizable and least understood architectural features. The earthquake bolt, sometimes called a gib plate, a long iron rod run through a building at floor level and anchored on the exterior wall with a decorative iron washer, tightened until the rod pulled the building's opposing walls back toward each other. Walk through Charleston's historic district today, and those washers are still there, cast in the shape of stars, discs, and lozenges, bolted into the sides of homes that have carried them for close to 140 years, a visible, catalogued, thoroughly ordinary piece of civic infrastructure that most visitors photograph without understanding that each one marks a wall the earth once tried to pull apart. The earthquake's own paper trail has a version of the same gap that runs through the rest of this account, and it has closed slowly, in stages, across more than a century. The first serious map of the 1886 damage, compiled by seismologist G.A. Bollinger in 1977 from an 1889 government report, plotted the known liquefaction sites across the epicentral region. In 1983, researchers Robinson and Talwani re-examined that same 1889 report and identified 6 confirmed cases of liquefaction, specifically on the Charleston Peninsula. Then, in 1986, researchers Peters and Herman located and published a body of original 19th century field notes and photographs on the earthquake that had simply gone missing from public view for nearly a century, sitting uncatalogued rather than destroyed. Working from that rediscovered material alongside newspaper accounts, A later liquefaction study raised the confirmed count of ground deformation sites within the city itself from 6 to 27, more than quadrupling what had been known for most of the 20th century, without a single new excavation. The evidence had been sitting in an archive the entire time. It simply had not been read. That pattern of the record catching up decades after the fact continued well into the 21st century. In 2024, seismologists Susan Huff and Roger Bilham revisited archival field notes and railroad survey records from the disaster, material that had sat mostly unexamined for over a century, and used the pattern of buckled and separated track to reconstruct how the ground moved during the event with more precision than the original 1880s investigators had the tools to manage. Their analysis, built entirely from paperwork that had simply been sitting in an archive since the 19th century, is a smaller and more recent version of the same story the Anson Street burial ground tells at a larger scale. Charleston's physical record and its documentary record are not the same thing, and closing the gap between them has never depended on new ground being broken so much as on someone finally going back to look at what had already been recorded and filed away. Some of what lies beneath the peninsula was never lost in the first place, only forgotten in the specific way that ordinary, everyday infrastructure gets forgotten once it stops being useful. The Cistern yard at the center of the College of Charleston's campus is the most visible example. The land beneath it was a colonial military barracks before the Revolution and passed to the college in 1785. In 1857, workers built a cistern there, 4 interconnected underground chambers of brick construction feeding a brick-lined well, designed to control flooding in the basement of Randolph Hall and to supply the surrounding blocks with water for drinking and firefighting. The completed system could hold as much as 40,000 gallons. Charleston did not install a citywide underground water system until 1879, which meant that for more than 2 decades the college's cistern was not a curiosity, but essential civic plumbing, and it meant that nearly every house built on the peninsula before 1890 had its own private cistern buried beneath it or built into its rear yard, since cisterns collected cleaner rainwater than wells that sat close to privies and stables. A typical Charleston cistern was fed by scuppers, channels built into the eaves of a roof that carried rainwater directly down into a sealed, watertight chamber, either beneath the house itself or set into the rear yard, keeping the household's drinking supply separate from the shallow wells that sat close enough to privies and stable yards to be routinely contaminated. The college's facilities staff now estimate that at least 10 and possibly as many as 50 separate cisterns survive somewhere across the campus, most of them unmapped, some rediscovered only when a renovation project or a sinking patch of lawn forces the question. The cistern behind the Bishop Robert Smith House, built between 1774 and 1778 as the parsonage for the rector of St. Philip's Church, still sits under moss in a garden a short walk from Meeting Street. A cistern at the John Scott House on Cumming Street survives the same way. A stone-lined shaft descending into darkness a homeowner can look down into today and see their own reflection roughly 10 feet below the surface. Multiply that pattern across every residential lot built before 1890, on a peninsula that has been continuously occupied since 1670, and the arithmetic becomes difficult to hold in the mind for long. Nobody has ever produced a complete map of Charleston's private cisterns because nobody was ever required to file one, and the ground underneath nearly every historic front garden in the city may still be holding a brick chamber that has not held water or been opened in well over a century. The effort to map what the city has forgotten it is standing on has in recent years become organized and deliberate rather than accidental. A volunteer group called the Walled City Task Force, working with historian Nick Butler of the Charleston County Public Library, has spent the past decade trying to relocate the earthen wall and moat that protected the southern edge of colonial Charleston in the 17th and early 18th centuries. A fortification line that shows up repeatedly in old survey documents and almost nowhere in the modern streetscape built on top of it. In June of 2016, task force members brought in archaeologist Dr. John Marcoux to run a ground-penetrating radar survey across the parking lot of First Baptist Church, chosen specifically because it was one of the few large, undeveloped stretches of ground along the wall's presumed path, in hopes of catching a stain in the soil that modern eyes could no longer read on the surface. A separate exploratory dig at the corner of King and South Battery Streets turned up brick and stonework that may or may not belong to the 1769 seawall the task force has spent years trying to confirm, built, according to surviving accounts, from a mixture of Bermuda stone and brick, along the edge of what is now White Point Garden. The task force's own volunteers described the results as suggestive rather than conclusive, an honesty about the limits of the evidence that stands in some contrast to the confidence with which the city's original 18th century surveyors drew that same wall onto their own maps. The pattern repeats on a smaller scale nearly every year. In the spring and summer of 2026, College of Charleston archaeology students, working under a professor identified in local reporting only as Platt, conducted a field school dig in the garden at 86 Church Street, one of the oldest residential lots in the city, chosen partly because earlier excavations across the street at the Hayward Washington House, a Georgian mansion built in 1772, had turned up productive results decades earlier. The Church Street team found bright orange, colonial-era brick, joined with unusually white mortar, just a few feet under the lawn, a combination old maps and the property's own surviving structures suggested might belong to the earliest phase of construction on the lot. The connection to that earlier work came through Martha Wallace, a freelance archaeologist who had grown up in a house across the street, still owned by her father, and who introduced the college team to the property only after meeting them by chance during a re-excavation at Hayward, Washington. None of these digs are secret. They are advertised, staffed by students, written up afterward in the local paper. What they keep finding, again and again, is simply how much of the ground under a 350-year-old city has never actually been checked. Taken together, these are not isolated curiosities scattered across a tourist map. They describe a single, consistent relationship between a city and the ground it was built on. Charleston kept excellent written records for the people and institutions it considered worth recording, filled a shelf of church registers, land deeds, and construction contracts stretching back to the 17th century, and left almost none of that same paper trail for the tens of thousands of enslaved and free black Charlestonians who built, supplied, and staffed the city, for the working cisterns that quietly kept its households alive before 1879, for the colonial fortifications that got built over rather than demolished, and for the exact mechanics of a night in 1886 when the ground itself briefly stopped behaving like solid earth. None of this required a hidden hand or a locked archive. It required only the ordinary, compounding effect of a city writing down what it valued and letting the rest go unrecorded, decade after decade, until the gap between the paperwork and the ground beneath it grew wide enough to swallow a burial ground of 36 people without anyone noticing for 2 centuries. The written archive, however extensive, was never a complete map of what the city actually contains. It was a record of what the city's institutions, at the time, considered worth writing down. The ground has continued to hold the rest, indifferent to what got filed and what did not, waiting for a backhoe, an earthquake, a ground-penetrating radar survey, or a graduate student with a trowel to bring it back up on its own schedule rather than anyone else's. That is, in the end, what the events of February 2013 actually demonstrated at the corner of George and Anson streets. The city of Charleston had, by that point, been standing on that particular patch of ground for roughly 213 years without a single document acknowledging what was 6 feet beneath the sidewalk. Every deed, every plat map, every parish register that passed through every owner of that land across 2 centuries was silent on the subject. The 36 people buried there were not concealed by any specific person or institution making a specific decision to hide them. They were simply never written down, in a city that reserved written permanence for some of its dead and denied it to others, and the omission held for 213 years until a piece of construction equipment cut into soil that had never stopped telling the truth whether or not anyone was writing it down. They have names now: Babatunde, Nana, Daba, Welela, the child with the coin still resting where someone placed it over her eye, and 32 others, chosen for them in a ceremony their own century never offered them, standing today at Anson and George Streets beneath a fountain of bronze hands that took 12 years to build. The paperwork of colonial Charleston said nothing about them for 250 years. The ground said everything the moment anyone finally asked it. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story!